Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to the second episode of Games as Lit 101's deep dive into The World Ends With You. Today we're talking about the game's use of mechanics as metaphor for its core thematic concepts, and wow, is there a lot to talk about here. Since this is part 2 of a larger series on The World Ends With You, I highly recommend starting with the first video if you haven't yet watched it, since this one will be building off of concepts and information presented in that first video. This series is primarily concerned with the original release of The World Ends With You on the Nintendo DS. The gameplay was designed with 2 screens in mind, so of course it's undergone changes in order to facilitate the single screen of the iPhone and the Switch, which means that depending on which platform you're playing the game on, your experience with the game may differ a bit from what you're going to see presented in this series. But the original design of the game was very intentional and metaphorical, and while the ports have worked admirably to retain some of that original meaning, the original design is still particularly worth talking about. So let's dive right into talking about the battle system of The World Ends With You, why it's kind of controversial, and why it's also kind of perfect. Combat in The World Ends With You takes place on both screens. Neku is on the lower screen, and the player uses the stylus to control his movement and a great variety of abilities they can collect throughout the game. Some require slashing the enemy, or slashing Neku, or tapping on an enemy, or tapping on open space, or holding on Neku, or dragging an object, even screaming into the mic, or all kinds of other touchscreen motions. It's frantic and intense, and by itself not all that different from other action games on the system that tried to use entirely touchscreen controlled battle systems, but it is generally far more chaotic and well designed than most. What sets it apart is that Neku's partner is on the top screen, and while the player is using the stylus to fight with Neku on the bottom screen, they're also using the system's D-pad or face buttons, depending on which hand they're using, to fight on the top screen. The top screen combat is relatively simple. The player presses the left or right buttons to attack enemies in that direction, and as they do, a branching path appears leading to a certain symbol. What symbols are there varies from partner to partner, but the point is that the player has to make a matching set to get a point towards using their cooperative ultimate ability that damages all enemies and heals a bit of health. Sound complicated and hard to manage? It is, which is why the game allows the player to put the top screen on autoplay, either entirely or just after a few seconds of inactivity. Managing both screens at once can be very difficult, since both of them work completely differently, but you'll do much better in battle if you put in the effort to make sure the two work well together. So a game about a loner who only wants to work by himself but is forced into a position where he has to work with other people and learn how to manage both his needs and the needs of this different person has a battle system about learning to manage 2 battles at once, both of which work differently to the benefit of all parties involved. See what I mean? This battle system isn't just hard to master, it's hard to grasp in the first place, and this is because the player is playing from Neku's perspective. Working with other people is hard for him, but he's forced to, and as he becomes more acclimated to it, more mechanics are introduced that give greater rewards for better collaboration between the top and bottom screens. Fusion allows for Neku and his partner to perform a powerful attack that also heals them both, assuming the player is able to utilize the top screen well enough to build up fusion power. There's a glowing aura called the Light Puck that's passed between the 2 screens whenever either performs a successful combo, and whoever has the Light Puck does more and more damage based on how many times it's been passed back and forth, assuming, of course, that the player can coordinate both screens to effectively alternate their attacks. The entire battle system is a metaphor for Neku learning to work with someone else. It's difficult, but learning how to manage this system is more rewarding for all parties involved, and you, of course, have to learn how to manage not only your own actions in battle, but even the actions of a different person who works in completely different ways. What's more, Neku will have multiple partners over the course of the game, and they all function differently. The base mechanics are the same, but the process of matching symbols to attain fusion differs each time, because different people are different, and Neku is having to learn how to understand people well enough to work with each of their unique natures. As we've begun to establish in this video series, The World Ends With You is primarily about the value of learning to appreciate, celebrate, and work with different people. It argues that we benefit from considering the perspectives and experiences and worldviews of a diverse group of people rather than simply avoiding them for the sake of fostering our own beliefs, and the very act of playing the game mirrors this core thematic concept. Of course, the game isn't aiming to be unplayable, which is why it includes the option to have the top screen controlled by the computer, and even has multiple ways to raise or lower the difficulty depending on your skill level and playstyle. But these affordances don't damage or cancel out the symbolism we're talking about here. You'll never find me claiming that accessibility options harm a game's meaning or design. For that matter, since Final Remix is out now, I should note that while the game's single-screen format doesn't lend itself to this metaphor as well as the original, the co-op mode essentially turns this idea of working together into an exercise between the two people playing the game. The better the two players coordinate and time their attacks between each other, the faster they raise their sync rate and the better their ultimate attacks. It's a cool spin on the original idea that actively applies it to the players, not just the characters. The battle system may be the biggest example, but it's far from the only one. The World Ends With You is packed with mechanical elements of the game that reinforce its story. The rest of these that we're going to talk about probably don't necessarily qualify as metaphorical, but they are certainly uses of the game's mechanics to reinforce and illustrate its message. For starters, it's packed with mechanics that display the way we affect and are affected by the people around us. This is most obvious in the popularity mechanics. The World Ends With You has a variety of equipment the player can use, from the pins that give Neku his psych abilities to clothing that grants stat boosts and other benefits. Pretty typical for a JRPG. What's not typical is that each of them is tied to one of 13 brands that make and sell clothing and accessories in Shibuya, and each area of the game has a separate popularity chart that tracks which brands are trending at the time. Pins belonging to brands in the top 3 will do more damage, and the lowest brand will have its attack halved, so you want to be careful to keep up with the trends to make sure you're as effective as you can be. Now, if that was all, we'd probably be talking about these mechanics as a commentary on consumer culture, and one that would end up being kind of uncritical and unsubstantial. But there's one more very important element to this whole setup. The player can not only adjust to the trends to their benefit, they can also change those trends. Wearing clothes, accessories, and pins of a certain brand will affect the popularity charts and can eventually move a brand out of the bottom spot and into the top, which means the system isn't just about following whatever the current trends are in Shibuya, it's about the symbiotic relationship between those trends and your own actions. When Shiki first talks to Neku about fashion, she says, "Trends here change really quickly, and they change you and the people around you, so it's better for you if you can stay in control of them." This relates to two major themes The World Ends With You uses to point to its primary messages: self-expression and personal agency. These mostly manifest in the story in later events that we haven't yet gotten to in this video series, but we're still seeing them right here in the mechanics, in the way that we're able to both be affected by and affect the RG Shibuya based on our actions in the Reaper's game. And of course, this means we have to branch out and try new things, too. If we have to use a specific brand in battle, we may not be able to work with the usual loadout we've grown accustomed to. Even our clothes and accessories may need to be switched out when we find a need to shift the trends of RG Shibuya. The story's message about reaching out beyond our existing preferences and experience is now expressed in this mechanic that allows and sometimes demands that we benefit from trying new things. The game even has a stat called Bravery, and some gear requires a certain amount of it to wear, and in a neat touch, none of the clothing or accessories are restricted based on the gender of the character. Neku can wear a dress if he wants, as long as he's brave enough. The tying of self-expression to one's confidence rather than their gender is a refreshing touch that works a lot better with what these mechanics are saying about self-expression. The idea of these game systems is that by being intentional about our choices and willing to branch out, we can not only shift our own personal situation to our advantage, but even the culture around us. That's an important part of the game's messaging, and again, we see it here embedded in the mechanics of the game, in the actual things that we, the player, do to progress through the game. We see this expressed in other, simpler ways as well. In the first video, I mentioned the imprinting mechanic, in which we can latch on to specific words and concepts and imprint them onto the minds of someone in the RG to influence their thoughts. We're literally using our words and ideas to direct people's thoughts in the same direction as ours. We do similar things when we play Reaper Creeper. It's basically like a Ouija board that's built to allow people from the UG to influence it. Many of the game's missions are essentially centered on reading people's thoughts, understanding what they need or want, and manipulating things to meet the desired outcome. Half the game is basically just about understanding people and helping them towards an outcome. All these mechanics are tied directly to the idea of influencing people with our own ideas and expression, which is not only an important part of what The World Ends With You is talking about in its story, it's also a vital concept in rectifying Neku's broken worldview. The game is using these mechanics to present us with the symbiotic relationship between our own lives and ideas and that of the people around us. Neku presupposes that he has nothing to gain from others, but these mechanics are built to prove him wrong by providing opportunities for the player to benefit others while also benefiting ourselves. The choices we make for ourselves and inspire in the RG are aimed toward helping them, and doing so, we're able to optimize our own performance and progress through the game. And of course, there theoretically exists the potential to use these abilities to harm other people or even ourselves, which is another part of what Neku needs to learn over the course of this game. Not only that he does stand to benefit from his relationships with other people, but that his negative actions have the potential to harm others. Which brings us to the final mechanical touches we'll be talking about in this video that contribute to the game's message. The World Ends With You isn't just a story that wants you to learn about relationships by playing it. It also wants you to actually go out and form those relationships. The game actually rewards you for not playing it. When you start the game back up, you're rewarded for up to 7 days of inactivity with experience for Neku's pins, making them more powerful and potentially evolving them into more powerful forms. What's more, the game has a food system wherein the player can buy food from some of the various stores in the game, but it takes time to digest it in-game, and they can only eat a certain amount per real-life 24-hour period. Point being, The World Ends With You has mechanics built in to encourage the player to limit their playtime. This is the game telling you to stop playing it every now and again and go live out its principles. But the game even takes this one step further by encouraging the player to interact directly with their friends and bond over the game itself. These mechanics have sort of been lost to time on account of no one carrying around their Nintendo DS with a decade-old RPG inside of it anymore, but we are talking about the game's design here, not how that design relates to modern consumer trends or old video game systems. The game has a mingle mode that allows the player to trade items and such with other people playing it, and even uses spot pass functionality to reward players who pass by each other in real life. In other words, it's not just rewarding the player for not playing, it's specifically rewarding them for interacting with others and trying to act as a catalyst for interpersonal connection. What all this means is that The World Ends With You isn't just a story about interpersonal connection, it's also a game about it, and a social impetus to actually go out and act on its ideas. And it can't really be overstated how impressive that is. Most games don't really do this much. Some common game mechanics are low-key examples, like how a leveling system is a mechanical representation of a character growing more capable as they gain more experience. Even experience mechanics are just a meter to measure the actual concept of doing a thing for a while and becoming familiar with it. But most games are content to keep their mechanics relevant to the story without using them to actually further its thematic premise. Shooting aliens in Halo, for instance, makes sense for what the story is about. It's not inconsistent, but there's also nothing about the act of shooting aliens in the face that speaks to the story's messages about the importance of acting on complete information or the corruption of religious power structures. It's just a thing you do in between the story's furthering of those ideas. Which is perfectly fine. Not every game needs to so intimately interweave its mechanics and its narrative to be effective. Mechanics are a construct through which we interact with the game's world, systems, and story. All the story really needs from game mechanics on a basic level are that those mechanics not actively contradict what the story's trying to say. But for a game like The World Ends With You that so clearly put a lot of effort and value into the story it's telling, it comes through a lot clearer for aligning the player's in-game actions with the messages the story is trying to get across. It's also just an impressive feat of game design. Video games are already a mishmash of a ton of different elements, from writing to programming to art to game design and so many other different things. To get all of those working together in harmony is an impressive enough feat as it is. To then go one step further and integrate the meaning of the mechanics and story in this way is a much larger challenge on top of all of that, and one that most game developers don't really find all that necessary. But for The World Ends With You, it pretty definitely makes it a far better game with a far stronger message. And of course, it's the reason I'll defend the game's convoluted, confusing ball of chaos that is the original battle system until the day I die. Of course, there's a lot more to The World Ends With You that we've barely even touched on so far, so make sure to join me next time as we talk about the second week of Neku's adventures in the Shibuya Underground. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and click that little bell down there if you want to be alerted to when that comes out. I hope you're enjoying this deep dive into one of my favorite games of all time, and I'll see you next time. Class dismissed.